Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Hive Live. I'm Alex Nette, and today we have a great cybersecurity workshop lined up for you. We are talking about insider threats. So, you may think about your company's cybersecurity as a castle, and you build the walls around that castle to protect your company. But what about what's happening inside your castle? Could someone in your company, either intentionally or unintentionally, cause you problems and impact your business's hard earned reputation? Well, joining us today is an expert in the field, Chris Cruz. Chris is an insider threat expert with over 10 years of experience across the disciplines of cybersecurity and information protection, intelligence analysis, and risk management. Chris has also worked hands-on with a number of insider threat programs across the Fortune 500 space and has led several efforts in both the public and private sector around data-driven decision-making, intelligence-driven defense, and risk-based security programs. He's also led investigations and intelligence collection efforts into dozens of significant cases involving theft of intellectual property, organized criminal activity, and even nation state threats to critical infrastructure and public safety. Chris holds degrees and university certificates in criminal justice, international relations, and information systems practices. Welcome, Chris.
Hey, Alex, thanks for having me here.
So we are excited today to talk about this and kind of step through the idea of what a insider threat program looks like and how to make all of those pieces align. And so our first part up here today is around understanding insider threat. And so to really lay the groundwork and the foundation for our discussion, I think to make sure that all of our viewers understand it, Chris, how do you define and what exactly is insider threat?
Yeah, sure. Great question, Alex. There's definitely a lot of thoughts around, the definition of insider threat, within the problem space. It really hasn't been standardized very well in the industry, but I think from my experience from the places I've seen it done, I think we really define insider threat or an insider threat is really any trusted user or account that is leveraging their access or authorization to cause harm to the business or the company. I think we often think about employees being our insider threats, but we can expand that to also think about our contractors, our third-party vendors, interns, even former employees who may still be able to retain some level of access, things like that.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I guess one of the big questions then is, while this all sounds great, I think a lot of companies trust the employees and folks that work with them, including third parties. So is this actually really something that's pervasive, or is it a niche issue? Is it only Fortune 500s that see this? What is kind of the spread of it?
Yeah, sure. It's definitely a problem that hits every industry, every type of business. Unfortunately, no one is truly immune to this type of threat or this type of risk. There's a number of resources out there that talk about it in depth. They get into the nitty gritty of the numbers and the statistics. The Verizon data breach report, Verizon also has their insider threat report each year. Those put out numbers suggesting that anywhere from 40% to 70% of insider threat incidents over the last 2 years are continuing to increase. There's also a ton of resources from companies like Proofpoint and other security vendors showing that anywhere from 70 to 90% of employees who leave a company are taking sensitive business data with them as they exit.
And that is a great report. For those of you who don't know, Verizon every year, and you might just think of them as your wireless provider or internet provider, they put out a great report called the DBIR that outlines some of the industry trends around how data breaches are impacting companies, what those look like, oftentimes costs and causes. And they put it out every year. It's got all kinds of graphics and great information. So definitely go take a look at last year's report for 2020. It is a wealth of information. So I think that probably then maybe gets to the question, who fits the profile of being an insider threat? What are some of the ways that we might be able to address those and categorize them, or maybe even recognize where those come from?
Yeah, sure. Trying to carve out that specific profile, it's really hard. It changes based on the business, the industry, even the culture of your company can all have an impact on it. We often say that trying to find an insider threat in your company or in a business at all is really like looking for that needle in a haystack. In fact, I would even go farther to say it's like looking for a needle in a stack of needles. Generally speaking, most of your employees are good, trustworthy users, right? But there will always be some high-risk individuals. And to break that down and to make it a little more digestible for users, we often think of a few different ways of breaking down the profiles of or potential personas of insider threats. I think most people kind of use a 5-category breakdown. So those 5 categories would include potential disgruntled employees. So these are someone who's maybe no longer happy with the company or wishes to cause some kind of harm or revenge scenario on the business. We have our malicious insiders. So these are users who've decided that the information in the organization or the data, it can be of significant personal gain to them. They want to take advantage of that opportunity, that access and authorization that they have. Another category or persona is the inside agent. So this is someone who's seeking to gain something from the organization. Sometimes it's not always about financial gain, right? It can be about other motivators or indicators that someone is looking for. But you can think about someone who's been recruited or solicited or even bribed by a third party, a competitor, maybe even a foreign government in order to disrupt the business or do something similar. The fourth category we can call the feckless third party. So a lot of organizations that have rely on third-party services, third-party vendors and companies to help accomplish their goals, further their mission, things like that. If the cybersecurity protections in your organization are not up to par, your third-party partners and vendors are now a risk factor, right? And because they are trusted individuals with access and credentials and things like that into your network, they kind of fall into that insider threat category as well. And the fifth one, the last one we can touch on, is really the careless worker, or maybe kind of the negligent worker we can think of. In your organization, you often have a lot of rules and regulations, maybe policies that dictate how people should and could use the technology, the resources available to them. But we often have people who may accidentally delete a number of critical business files that may disrupt business services. You could think of someone who maybe forgets their laptop in their car and it is stolen, car is broken into and the laptop is stolen. Or we could even think of a user who is not up to par from a cybersecurity awareness perspective, and maybe they click on a really bad phishing link and download some ransomware, and now you've got dozens of systems kind of blocked or locked out or encrypted on your network, right? So that careless worker, that potentially negligent worker who, is not malicious in nature, but may accidentally cause, an incident or a cybersecurity breach, is another way of thinking about insider.
That's interesting. That delineation, that insider threat isn't necessarily always malicious in nature. That is a threat to the business in the sense that something could go wrong, but it could be intentional or unintentional. I'll make a plug too. We had a previous conversation around third-party risk with Priscilla and Lydia just a few months ago that dove into how we can manage and better understand and mitigate third-party risk. So make sure to check out that episode. Um, I think that all makes sense to me. Is that generally the best way to break down kind of those classifications of users, or are there different ways of looking at it?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the more common ones. There are some other ones that try and make it even simpler than that. Maybe they just break it down into, malicious users and negligent users, and then compromised users. There are some resources and frameworks out there where they go much more in depth, and you have a variety of profiles and a variety of intents or reasons why someone would kind of harm the company, and you sort of cross stitch them to create these different views of risk, and it's kind of an interesting way to kind of bubble up high risk personas and scenarios versus lower risk ones in your business.
I think that nicely takes us on to the next piece, which is understanding and identifying those insider threats. So now that we have a view into some of the personas and ultimately maybe some of the influencing ways that they may become insider threats, let's talk about identifying them. So, with all that said, obviously it might be a experiment in psychology to understand where and how those people are. But how do we rather than qualitatively, how do we quantitatively collect some data? Are there tools or methods or subscriptions to services? What are some ways to maybe start to identify those insider threats?
Yeah, for sure. There's a ton of options out there. From my personal experience, I find there's a lot of vendors they're pushing into this space, talking about new tools, next generation tools, and all this stuff. I think it's a great time to be in the insider threat space. Very interesting, but at the same time, I don't think that there's no single tool, there's no silver bullet. There's sadly no kind of off-the-shelf box so you can just plug and play that catches insider threats for you. I think from my experience, the best method is really kind of mirroring what we do to protect against external threats which is really kind of relying on a combination of a risk-based approach to combating insider threat, as well as using kind of a defense in depth strategy, right? So layering different processes and frameworks, and then layering different types of tools to close a variety of risk gaps. If we want to talk a little bit more about like specific tools, I can definitely say that for me personally, I've seen a lot of success in different companies when you combine kind of a DLP tool. So it's a data loss prevention tool that typically deploys to your endpoints, to your user laptops. And that allows you to exercise some amount of technical controls, kind of limit what users are able to do. And you take that DLP tool and you combine it with what they call a UBA tool, or user behavior analytics tool. And that allows you to take tons of logs and put them into a tool, and it will spit out kind of the unusual, abnormal, or anomalous behavior that it detects across your user group. And that's usually one of the ways that we try and find insiders. We look for people who are kind of deviating from the norm, right? Here's 300 people in a company. 300 people are usually doing the same kind of business day in and day out. And here's 3 users who are kind of off on the side. They are doing outlier activity, and we kind of use that to identify them. Some other really interesting tools that I think are useful in the insider threat space include any kind of log aggregation tools you can get. The more logs you have, the more visibility you have. Usually it becomes easier to find those abnormal and unusual events. I'm a really big fan of what they call SOAR tools. Those are kind of security orchestration tools. And those allow you to plug in a variety of different tools into kind of one central place. You can do a lot of automation, particularly with your kind of day-to-day monitoring and response capabilities. So that's an area that I think there's a ton of growth potential as well. And then another thing I always love to throw out is I think a sign of a really mature insider threat program typically tends to be the development or deployment of kind of a proactive threat hunting effort or program. Usually in order to get that, you need a kind of a variety of tools in place already. You do need some maturity kind of in your program. And you need to have that really good logging and technical controls in place. But it's definitely a great North Star to set when you're talking about kind of growing and maturing an insider threat program.
Yeah, you mentioned some of those tools that are looking for more of those heuristic behaviors, right? Things that deviate from the norm. What would be some examples of some of those heuristic behaviors that might fire and warrant an investigation into what maybe somebody's doing, or why that alert occurred?
Yeah, sure. There's a whole bunch. Some really interesting ones could be a user has sort of an unusual or abnormal spike in emails going to a personal email address, or maybe even just a free domain email address like a Gmail or a Yahoo or even an AOL if you're old school, right? So it's things like that. We also have looked in the past for unusual amounts of upload or download activity. So let's say I'm an engineer and I have access to a server that has very sensitive, spec materials, 3D drawings, CAD materials, things like that. And normally, from a day-to-day perspective, I'm only downloading 2 or 3 files to do my work. But maybe 3 weeks before my retirement date, I download 3,000 files. I download almost the whole server to my computer. Right now, that's an unusual and abnormal activity. That's the kind of thing we would look for. Maybe talk to the user, see, hey, what's the motivation here? Why'd you conduct this type of download? So things like that, and it kind of goes across the gambit of technical indicators. What can you see your users do, and then how can you baseline it, and then kind of identify those spikes in activity.
That is interesting. And actually, we just got a question in about that. Somebody asked, why do so many employees take data when leaving a company?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's such a common issue. Like I said earlier, reports say that 70 to 90% of employees are taking data with them when they leave. It's a common problem everywhere I've been, and the reality is that people just have this incredible sense of ownership, whether they've been there for a few years or 30 years. It's a combination of kind of pride in the work they've done. They want to take it with them. Some of them just for posterity, just to have and remember. But sometimes they just want to take the work with them because they think it will be useful as reference material for their next opportunity or their next job or career changes, things like that. So it's just such a common issue that we face there in the insider threat area.
Well, when we talked as we kind of moved through that, and I think trust in your organization and working there is a key piece, especially around small and medium-sized businesses. We've talked though about some of these larger tools, and from a data aggregation side that include very large scale tools like Splunk and some of these other options. And DLP tools for endpoint solutions are generally geared towards slightly larger companies. So, what would maybe be some thoughts or considerations for those small and medium sized companies that maybe don't have as robust IT or the infrastructure or potentially even the funds to invest in some of these tools that might be normally geared towards larger enterprises?
Yeah, totally great question. And I think smaller businesses are really in an interesting position from that scenario, right? The smaller footprint, of a small and medium business definitely gives you some advantages, right? Usually have less employees you're concerned about, but at the same time, you have, like you said, less resources available to kind of tackle the problem. Generally, thinking about small and medium businesses, often my advice is to really number one, really drive down onto the culture of your company. Insider threat is just as much a people problem as it is a technology problem, right? And so if you can drive a really good culture, a culture that embraces kind of trust and security, you can make huge headway in kind of establishing, the right kind of security posture for your company. I'd also recommend, if you really want to deep dive into tools and services for small and medium businesses, another thing to think about would be, don't rush to just kind of buy something off the shelf. Like I mentioned earlier, there really isn't that silver bullet, box that you can just plug in and spits out insider threats for you, right? Um, Instead, I find a lot of businesses tend to have a number of tools or services that are already there, already deployed on the network, in the systems, in the business processes, that they can take advantage of to grow their visibility, to collect logs, to apply some amount of technical controls and blocking. And I really encourage businesses to kind of inventory what they have, from a software, from a services, from a vendor perspective. Sometimes you have services available, you just don't realize it. You may even already be paying for it. And sometimes it's just, it might be an extra fee, or it might even just a flip of a switch to kind of deploy a new function or technology that could limit insider threats.
That's a great point. With a lot of small and medium sized businesses and even enterprises taking advantage of the cloud, a lot of these SaaS providers, to include Google Workspace, formerly G Suite, and Office and Microsoft 365, oftentimes they have options for some rudimentary protections, sometimes around DLP and tracking some of that information. But you have to know where it is and to go turn it on. And that sometimes is part of the problem as we look at that comparison between the world of IT and getting something to work, and the world of cybersecurity and getting it to work securely. So sometimes finding those options, turning them on and tuning them to your business can be part of it. But again, as Chris said, you may already be paying for it. You just haven't been using it to date. Um, I think that brings me actually to my next question pretty nicely, because ultimately a lot of companies are moving to the cloud. We're having less of a very fixed castle structure, and it's much more of a maybe like a Super Mario castle structure, where it is literally and figuratively floating in the cloud and a moving target as a result. So how do we kind of start to address these things where maybe now we're no longer working within a very centralized core area of IT, but lots of disparate clouds that are connected with a CRM and an email and another file server and a document signing thing? How do we align all those pieces and deal with insider threat from that perspective?
Yeah, amazing question, and it's probably, one of the top questions kind of in the insider threat area right now, is as so many companies navigate the cloud migration that we're seeing, across every industry essentially. What is the impact or effect from a data protection or an insider threat perspective? It's definitely a notable impact for sure, and it kind of swings both ways. I think one way to think about it is, from a risk perspective, is that beyond just moving to the cloud, right? You've now got all your data, maybe even your sensitive, your critical data, your crown jewel information, could be sitting, in someone else's computer. Essentially, that's what we think of as the cloud, right? So now you've got to make sure that as you migrate to the cloud, do those cloud providers, those third-party cloud services, offer the level of protection that you need for your data specific to insider threats? And it could be a combination of the insider threats in your company or your business taking advantage of cloud services and cloud access, but it's also about the insiders or the employees or contractors in those vendors, in those cloud service providers. Do they have the right kind of access controls? Do they have the right type of visibility limitations, right? So when you move to the cloud, it's so many benefits, right? But you do take on some new risks. One of those is that, a doomsday scenario you could think of is, a rogue or a disgruntled contractor for, a cloud provider just decides to start yanking plugs in the back of servers one day because he's not satisfied, right? So you could have an impact on something that you have such small visibility into. So that's something I always kind of love to talk about with different people in different companies is, make sure you're understanding the new risks you're taking on. I think the other interesting about cloud is that it really changes the visibility of your network space, right? It's no longer, like you said, that single Mario castle, right? Now you kind of got this disparate system. Now it looks like the map from Super Mario 3, maybe. You've got all these worlds connected with bridges and things like that, right? And so it's really interesting. It's a new topography to think about. And so traditionally, insider threat relied heavily on the endpoint. We monitored logging and activity that was happening on someone's laptop, on someone's computer. But if you migrate a lot of services to the cloud, you start losing some of that endpoint visibility, and you've got to make it up somewhere else through application logs, through server logs, things like that. So a potential example you could think of is maybe I'm an employee in a company, and maybe I'm a finance manager, and I have access to really sensitive, critical kind of finance data. And I'm working on a really sensitive report, but I'm using, Office 365 Excel online, essentially, right? And so that's not really touching my computer. I can create, edit, manage, and tweak that spreadsheet all from the cloud without some DLP tools ever even noticing or being able to see what I'm doing. And then I could take advantage of like the really awesome sharing opportunities, sharing tools within Microsoft and within cloud services to potentially share that data to my personal email address or maybe connect it to my Google Drive account. And again, that data could cross the network, from cloud to cloud in theory, and it would never touch your business network. It would never touch your endpoints if you don't have the right type of security setup. If you haven't taken the time to really onboard your cloud vendors, the ideal way possible, and set up, those technical security controls. This reminds me of a really good case actually, where there was actually a company in the United Kingdom who had a disgruntled employee who was terminated, and he was on kind of one of their cloud management teams. So he was managing a lot of the cloud services and servers that the company had. He found out he was going to get laid off, and so he actually was terminated from the company, but spoke to a peer, another friend at the company, was able to log in to the cloud servers with the friends, the peer coworkers account, and actually went through and deleted 23 AWS servers that the company relied on for critical business data. So this was a guy who, just angry at the world, wanted to take revenge, right, and just cause drastic damage to this company. And they only knew it was happening once the servers and data were gone, right? Once they had critical failures occurring, now they knew something bad was happening. So we definitely see, a lot of missteps in cloud configurations, things like that. We hear constantly stories about people put something in an AWS bucket and, forget to set the right settings, and now it's public facing without them realizing it. So that's obviously kind of that accidental or negligent insider. But there are, the cloud is just as much a risk factor as it is a tool that an insider threat could use against you, I think.
I think you make a very interesting point there. When we started our discussion, we were talking a little bit around data and protecting that data, kind of keeping it with your business and where it belongs and making sure that it's not misshared. But you're right, there's a little bit of a crossover between insider threat and some of the other activities that we think about in the world of cybersecurity, looking at disaster recovery, availability, and protecting it, because that same insider threat could cause things to stop working. And so, yeah, if maybe you're using a cloud service provider email, and someone is the admin, they could go in and just turn that service off, and all of the emails are gone and it doesn't work. So no one can email. That brings your business to a standstill. So that's a very good point, that there is a broader crossover in terms of just the insider threat.
Yeah, for sure.
I think that takes us nicely into our final part here around managing insider risk and what that ultimately looks like. And so this is kind of where we'll get a little bit more tactical in our discussion. So I think one of the first places is for those who are watching today that do not have an insider threat program. Where do you start on this? We've obviously talked about some strategies that are in various parts of the life cycle for maturity, but for someone who's trying to get started, where do they start?
Yeah, great question. There's no silver bullet solution on a starting point, but I think an incredibly good rule of thumb that I've always followed, and I tell every everyone who comes and asks me a similar question, where do we go? Where do we start? How do we kick off insider threat? I always tell people kind of start with what I always call coalition building. So because insider threat, like you mentioned, it stretches across different facets of the company, stretches across different facets of just cybersecurity sometimes. And because of that, you really need kind of a cross-functional group, or maybe like a cross-disciplined group, to kind of tackle, what your insider threat program is going to look like. It looks different at every company. I've seen it at so many big companies. I've seen it at small companies. I've seen what teams and programs look like in the public sector. I've even seen teams and programs in private, not even like nonprofit sectors, protecting all different types of data. I always say if you've seen one insider threat program, you've really only seen one insider threat program, because they are all pretty unique in the way they tackle it. But I think regardless of that, everyone has to have that key starting point with that coalition. So it's bringing the right people to the table to start those initial discussions about how do we do this the best way for our company and the best way for the data we have. So when you think about who that might be, typically it includes your cybersecurity and your IT teams. Obviously, I think that's pretty clear. But also you want to make sure you're including the people or teams that might work on your asset management, right? Making sure that you can't protect what you don't know you have. So if you don't even know how many servers are in your business, how many laptops people are assigned, right? You're not even going to know what to protect. So you got to have really good asset management, and you also have to have the whoever is managing or helping you with your identity and access management controls, right? So we're talking about provisioning accounts, setting up admin accounts, all that kind of stuff. Those people kind of need to be in the room as well. And I think beyond that, sometimes there are other teams that get left in the dust, and I think it's because people just don't remember kind of that cross-functional nature of insider threat. So I always encourage people to remember to bring in your legal or your privacy teams if you have them, or if you have representation in those areas. It's critical to get their support, their buy-in, and also their expertise. Human resources or employee relations teams are critical. Like we talked about earlier, this is just as much a people problem as it is a technology problem, and so you need those people experts at the table. And then I think a team often overlooked is if you have a kind of a physical security team. So if you have someone doing loss prevention, or if you have someone doing physical security of sites or offices or buildings, bringing them into the mix is really important, because they give a really unique perspective. And there are plenty of scenarios of insider threat that involve physical actions, physical sabotage of systems. And if you even think about it, one of the easiest ways to take data is I plug a USB drive into my laptop and I just copy over everything on it and just walk out the door. You really think about it, that's kind of a hybrid scenario where, there's the technology use, but then there's the physical movement of that data, in my hand, in my briefcase, right? So I think it's important to bring that physical side into it as well.
Very interesting. And you mentioned this earlier too, but you talked about a risk-based approach to this. Obviously, the coalition building is a big part of it. And like you said, every program is different in its approach. How do you then maybe tailor that risk for the business? Is there a good strategy to kind of start in that, or is it a feel it out? What are kind of some steps or ways you could move through that?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a number of ways to do it. I think a common way to think about it is if we use kind of the NIST, NIST cybersecurity framework as an example. And if we look at NIST, it kind of breaks down cybersecurity into those I think it's 5 core functions, right? Identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, right? So if you look at those and you overlay those 5 categories onto your insider threat program, or what you want an insider threat program to look like, it starts giving you a framework for at the beginning, asking the right questions and kind of framing the right discussions. So if we take the first function, identify, we can ask ourselves, have we identified the crown jewels of our business? And when I say crown jewels, these are typically thought of as kind of I'll say, the honey of the beehive, right? This is our trade secrets, our intellectual property, our critical business data that we need to be better than our competitors, that we need to be top in the industry, right? And so if we don't know what our crown jewels are, we can't protect that most sensitive and critical data. So that's a great way of starting with just identify. How do we identify the sensitive data? And if you take that same scenario and kind of walk it down the different steps of NIST, of the cybersecurity framework, you can start saying, well, how can we detect, right? how can we detect movement of our crown jewel data? And then we can talk about protection, like what protections are in place for the crown jewel data. And we can take it to response and say, okay, if we lose crown jewel data, what is the process to respond? Do we have a policy? Do we have an SOP in place? Kind of tells the team what to do in that critical loss event like that. And then when we think about, recover, what are the steps, what are the processes we need to recover from a loss? If we have a significant trade secret and let's say it is lost to a competitor, what are our actions, what are our options, and how do we recover from that, short term and long term? And this is why it's so important to bring that kind of cross-functional group together, because you will probably have people in your IT organization who can't answer all those organizations or those questions, I should say, but people in your legal, your human resources, your physical security teams can bring so much knowledge to those issues.
And actually, great point. We just got a question around that. Is corporate espionage or competitor theft really a significant risk?
Yes, yeah, I see this question come up a lot. A lot of people say, it's a 1 in a million event. It's a black swan event. It's a critical thing, but it's never going to happen to me. It's so rare. I think you could argue, you can argue that to your blue in the face, I suppose. But I'll just share, one of my favorite anecdotes is, there's a famous case of a U.S. company, American Superconductor, who was, an incredible company. Had nothing but the moon to reach for, essentially, for the work they were doing. They had an employee who was bribed by a competitor to provide critical trade secret information, and the employee jumped on the opportunity. They gave him quite the package to convince him, for sure. But the employee took the critical data, left the company, gave it to the competitor, and the losses were staggering. American Superconductor lost half its stock price. It was forced to cut 700 jobs over the course of several years. They lost billions of dollars in equity in their company. They lost incredible amounts of market share that I'm not sure they've still kind of made up till this day. And I'm sure they were thinking, and I know for a fact that they had tons of security controls in place, but at the end of the day, they had that attitude of, this could never happen to us. This is not something, a true risk that we need to be prepared for. And I think it speaks to the fact that, as technology grows and changes, it will always be influenced by kind of the geopolitical landscape in some regards. And so, I think it's important to kind of leverage, of that defense in depth and that risk-based approach to ensure you're kind of covering your all hazards, security scenarios.
And I know that we are a little over on time, but I will ask you my final question, which is really any other general advice or guidance around this? Anything else that people should be aware of or keep an eye out, either in planning their own program or looking for tools or vendors to come in and support them and help them?
Yeah, sure. I think a critical thing to think about, something I always am compelled to mention when I talk about insider threat is privacy, and it's really making sure that you have privacy considerations kind of baked into your insider threat program. As we see across the world, more and more countries, even more and more states here in the U.S. are adopting better, stronger, bigger privacy laws to protect not just our PII, our personal identifiable data, but it's also meant to protect the data, that a company has on its employees, on its contractors, people like that. So if you're engaging in an insider threat program, or you're building one out, or even thinking about establishing one, you need to think about, what can we do from a privacy perspective with regards to monitoring employee activity. What can we do to make this program successful, but still keep privacy as kind of one of the core tenets, to kind of respect your employees, but to support that culture of trust that is so critical to success.
That was great. Well, that is all the time that we have today. I want to thank Chris for joining us and providing his insights on how to manage insider threats. I think one of my key takeaways was when Chris mentioned that really insider threat is as much a people problem as much as a technology problem. And I think that's a great way to look at it, that there is no silver bullet solution out there on the market. And oftentimes it's about understanding your people and some of those profiles that we talked about and how to address them and prevent that. So I hope you find his stories and experiences as useful as I did today. In the meantime, make sure to sign up for our next event at hivesystems.io/Hive Live. Next month in May, our guest is Brad Thies. He is the founder and president of Bar Advisory. And he and I are going to be having a roundtable discussion about the cybersecurity trends that are shaping the future of cloud service providers. So make sure you don't miss it and sign up today at www.hivesystems.io/HiveLive. Until next time, remember, when it comes to cybersecurity, you need to act and not react. Take care. Thank you.